Today, the London hospitals have been put under pressure by having to take in a large number of COVID-19 patients who need ventilation. It has been a major crisis and a major challenge for healthcare systems in this country. But it's not the first time this has happened. What I want to talk about is the response of the Sick and Hurt Board to the crisis faced by the London hospitals and the problem of wounded seamen under the Commonwealth. One of the solutions was to build and equip temporary special hospitals for naval casualties of the Dutch wars in the early 1650s. Ely House was commandeered as a naval hospital, and also the Savoy Palace. It's a bit like the use of the Excel Centre for Nightingale Hospital and the Nightingale hospitals set up throughout the country to relieve the pressure on NHS hospitals through the coronavirus epidemic. Ely House had been the London townhouse of the Bishops of Ely. All that's left of it today is the chapel of St Etheldreda. The Savoy Palace, the Savoy Chapel, is mainly what remains of that. But it is interesting to see how it was the pressure on ordinary hospitals which led to their establishment. The Dutch wars of the early 1650s had precipitated a major crisis for the Commonwealth of how to deal with the large number of naval casualties which were then being landed on the south coast and in East Anglia. This was all to have repercussions for the sick and poor of the capital. The usual governmental response to any crisis, any problem, was the setting up of a new official body to deal with it. And the Commonwealth government established the Sick and Hurt Board, with powers to decide how the sick and wounded who were sent into Dover from ships in the service of the Commonwealth may be provided for both in respect to the supplying of them with money, as also for the appointing of able physicians and surgeons to attend the recovery of the said men. It decreed in December 1652 that in the moiety of hospitals in England be reserved for such as shall be wounded in the service of the Navy. Well, London, as the capital, had some of the biggest and most prestigious of these hospitals, ones with the largest endowments, though they were intended for the sick poor. But inevitably, this did mean that the London hospitals would come under pressure to deal with the problem. Now, traditionally, the welfare of the wounded seamen had been the responsibility of the Chatham Chest, which since the reign of Elizabeth I had been funded by contributions from mariners themselves and from collections from English parishes. However, this was much more concerned with pensions for the disabled rather than the medical treatment of the wounded and sick, which was now the immediate problem. And claimants had to travel to Chatham to make their claims in person before the trustees. It wasn't always easy to get them there from distant ports. And financial mismanagement of the Chatham Trust funds also made it less effective than it might have been. Although by the 1640s it was being much more efficiently managed than it had been before, or indeed was to be later. Meanwhile, the Elizabethan Poor Law placed the burden of looking after disabled sailors on the parish in which they were born. However, the immediate costs for the sick and wounded from a naval engagement had to be met by funds that came beyond the parish. They weren't being treated in the parish of their birth, and it was an unfair burden on those parishes close to the coast. So the immediate costs for the sick and wounded of medical treatment, surgeons' fees, and indeed board and lodgings had to be met at the expense of the government. A 34-year-old physician, Daniel Whistler, was placed in charge of the medical needs of the wounded seamen being landed on the entire south coast and East Anglia. In 1653, Whistler was concerned about the contemporary system of billeting the sick and the wounded wherever they could be fitted into farmhouses, shops and taverns. Their care would then be contracted out to local doctors. But what especially disturbed him, not surprising in those godly days, was the resultant difficulty in charge otherwise of ordering their diet, nursing the thronging of weak men into poor, stifling houses, the temptations to them of drink inordinately in victualling houses who have no other but strong drink. There was also a want of linens and medicines timely, which should be in readiness aforehand in store. In other words, the government should have known what was coming and should have made preparations. Sound familiar? He would also have preferred to have seen all of the wounded and sick brought together in a hospital, where not only would their medical and nursing needs be seen to much more efficiently, but where they could be brought under some form of discipline and moral control. As soon as they left their ships, the sailors were answerable to no one. And how many of them could resist the temptations of the alehouse? Whistler even looked at the possibility of converting the ruins of Portchester Castle near Plymouth into a naval hospital, which was for all air and water healthful. He also looked at whether it might not cost more to repair an old castle as to build a new house nearby. However, there was no money available either to convert a redundant building or to build it fresh. Men continued to be billeted close to where they were landed. Had there been anywhere else, it would not only have been more efficient and more cost-effective and more efficacious, but it would also have taken the strain off London, to which most of the invalids would be sent as soon as they were in a suitable condition to travel. In the task of organising medical care in 1653, Whistler was helped by Elizabeth Alkin. She had been a former Roundhead spy who was generally nicknamed Parliamentary Joan, and her royalist opponents called her an old bitch who could smell out a loyal-hearted man as soon as the best bloodhound in the army. Now, Elizabeth Alkin, at her own expense, nursed the sick, and she arranged for them to be taken by car to London, where they could be admitted to a hospital. The personable Daniel Whistler was to be rewarded for his work by being included in a legation to the Swedish court of Queen Christina, and he later became president of the Royal College of Physicians. The corpulent Alkin had fewer charms, and she didn't even receive the pension promised her by Parliament for her espionage activities. She was to die alone in her lodgings in the Palace of Westminster, having had to sell her bed to buy the medicines she needed after falling ill, soon after she returned from nursing the sick and wounded of Portsmouth and in East Anglia. Most of the men she had nursed were sent off to London as soon as possible. Indeed, the London hospitals, mainly St Bartholomew's and St Thomas's, had been placed on alert on the 3rd of January 1653 to be in a condition to receive presently wounded and sick mariners to the number 50, if there shall be urgent occasions. The wounded men began to arrive in February. This was to put a severe strain on the voluntary hospitals, whose primary purpose, after all, was to provide hospital care for the sick poor of London. They received a payment of only 2 shillings a week from the government for each patient. So this meant that the financial burden was to be unfairly shouldered by the hospitals. On the 2nd of December 1653, St Thomas's Hospital petitioned in vain for some gratuity for their extraordinary care and pains of and among the soldiers and seamen in this house. The petition went unanswered. Now, the presence of undisciplined and unruly sea soldiers in the civil hospitals was to pose another challenge above the financial, that of maintaining discipline. On the 22nd of May, 1653, at St Bartholomew's, all the sea soldiers were summoned to appear this day at the counting house, and it was resolved that if they did hereafter disorder themselves by drink, or did lie out of their wards, or did not observe the rules in this house, that they should be presently dismissed this hospital and put out of the estate's pay. 2 of the sea soldiers disobeyed this instruction, being commonly drunk and distempered, and they were to be discharged from the hospital for drunken unruliness and for fighting in the King's Ward. Interesting that there was still a King's Ward, even though Charles I had been beheaded and the monarchy abolished. The problem was that the wounded soldiers, sailors and marines being treated at the civilian hospitals were no longer considered to be under military or naval discipline. As a result, it was much more difficult to maintain any sense of discipline among them than if they had been in state-controlled military or naval hospitals. Well, temporary naval hospitals were established for surgical cases at Savoy Palace and for medical cases at Ely House, and they were directly under the control of the Admiralty, which was now able to exert greater social control over its seamen. Special regulations were laid down for their conduct by commissioners appointed by the Commonwealth. In Ely House and the Savoy Hospital, scolding, brawling or chiding were forbidden, strikers, fighters, quarrellers, or men who shall play at unlawful games or sit up unseasonably at night were strictly punished. For first offence, a man would be set in the stocks. He forfeited a week's pay for his second offence and would be discharged summarily from the hospital for any third offence. However, no man could be punished or expelled for being drunk without having first been examined by an overseer at the Savoy or by a surgeon at Ely House. And despite all of this tight discipline, in both hospitals they were issued with clay pipes, tobacco and beer for their greater comfort and relaxation. The Savoy Hospital had been founded originally by Henry VII in what had once been John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace on Strand, and had been periodically used for naval casualties in the succeeding century and more. There were 100 naval surgical patients there in 1653, tended by 2 surgeons and 12 nurses. Bed cradles were provided for any men who had had a limb amputated. Their wounds were dressed with cotton dyed red and bandaged with a linen roller made from surpluses recently confiscated by the Puritans from the city churches. Men who had lost their legs were first of all supplied with crutches and then were given iron or wooden legs that were fitted onto their stumps with straps. Ely House had once been the townhouse of the Bishops of Ely, until part of it was confiscated and assigned to Sir Christopher Hatton in the reign of Elizabeth I. Part of it still had continued as a residence for the bishops, but more recently during the Commonwealth, it had been used as a prison. So, from having once been a very palatial townhouse, it had now become first a prison and finally requisitioned as a naval hospital. There were 100 medical patients under the care of 1 physician, 2 apothecaries and 12 nurses. Now, Ely House as a hospital also contained a special ward known as the hothouse. This was staffed by 2 male nurses and was fitted out with a copper bath in which the patients were sweated. Sweating was a standard treatment for syphilis, for the pox, and the idea was that the heat would drive the corruption out of the body. This sweating in copper baths was carried out for as long as the patient could stand the high temperatures, for between 3 days and a week. During this time, the patient would be denied food to prevent noxious odours from building up in his body. Well, it's salutary to think that even in those godly days of the Commonwealth, vice flourished and had to be dealt with. It was not just medical needs that were attended to in the naval hospitals, these temporary naval hospitals. They also functioned as almshouses for disabled sailors, their families, widows and children. When the hospital in Ely House was finally closed in 1660, the House of Commons had to consider how and in what manner the said widows, orphans and maimed soldiers at Ely House may be provided for and paid for the future with the least prejudice and most ease to the nation, and how a weekly revenue may be settled for their maintenance. and how the maimed soldiers may be disposed of, so as the nation may be eased of the charge, and how they may be provided of a preaching minister. The House of Commons wanted to save money. They also wanted to provide for the religious, spiritual and moral welfare of the people they were expelling from Ely House. Well, in 1675, a policy of financial retrenchment following the end of the Dutch Wars saw the closure of the Savoy Hospital. Naval casualties were now once more sent to St Bartholomew's and St Thomas's hospitals. The payment the hospitals received of twopence a day for each naval patient was not raised, and was far cheaper than the expense of boarding the men out in the ports and of employing local surgeons to attend them. The governors of St Bartholomew's and St Thomas's felt strongly that this was a great imposition upon them, as indeed it was. But there was little they could do to oppose it. There was nowhere else for the men to be sent. Now Ely House and the Savoy had been closed, and the city fathers had to accept that the London hospitals would bear the burden. So it's interesting to see the way in which both the civil and naval hospitals in London had all responded magnificently to the demands placed upon them by mounting naval casualties during the Dutch wars of the 1650s. In Ely House and the Savoy Hospital, the sick and wounded could be concentrated in one place, receive more efficient treatment from skilled and experienced physicians and surgeons much more cheaply than in the ports in which they had been landed. This saved the state money. More importantly, the seamen could be kept under control. Now, although the great voluntary hospitals of St Bartholomew's and St Thomas's reduced the state bills for medical care, transferring the financial burden to the governors of the two hospitals, and also, very significantly, depriving the citizens of London of their regular access to healthcare, there were advantages to the Admiralty-controlled naval hospitals. These meant that it was possible to maintain naval discipline among the sick and convalescing men. And during the Commonwealth, and indeed well into the Restoration period, saving the seaman from debauchery was as much an imperative as was the task of saving his life.